Good evening, everyone. This is the Authors Guild Foundation's 13 WIT talk, and it is our final talk of this season. We're taking a break as we go into our gala and guild night planning. So WIT stands for those of you who are new, Words, Ideas, and Thinkers. And in these conversations, we explore important current events, issues, and ideas. WIT also celebrates authors and writers as the thought leaders of their time. But before I introduce our speakers, let's do a little bit of light housekeeping. To have the best viewing experience, please put your screen on speaker mode versus gallery mode so you have the important people, Gish and Bethanne, maximized on the screen. And we do love for these talks to be conversational, so we leave a lot of time at the end for Q&A. My colleague Nikki will call on you during that Q&A period if you raise your hand, but if you're shy, you can put your question in the chat and she will read it for you. But we do like people to talk to the speakers. I just want to tell you one more thing. We have an in-person event we are organizing called the WIT Festival. This is a 3-day series of conversations held in the Berkshires in the town of Lenox. The 2022 theme for our festival this year is Reimagining America. And we have an amazing lineup of topics that deal with climate change solutions, when religion meets science, reimagining Black history, the U.S.'s changing role in the world, identity and belonging, the changing Supreme Court, very timely today, and pandemics then and now. Speakers who are committed include David Blight, Elizabeth Colbert, Dan Brown, Nikki Bowie, Linda Greenhouse, among many others. Nikki has the link, or will have the link in the chat. We would love for you to join us there. Again, it's free and open to the public. And, you know, the Berkshires that time of year is just perfect. For those of you who don't know me, I should have started with this. My name is Lynn Bolger. I am the Executive Director of the Authors Guild Foundation. Tonight, we will be discussing Opening China, Opening Lives with Gish Jen and Bethanne Patrick. Bethanne is a writer, author, and critic. If you follow anything literary related on social media platforms, books, reviews, reviewers, literary criticism, new releases, you have probably come across her. She is the book maven on Twitter. One writer said about her, she is an avid champion of books and writers, always careful to shine a light on emerging authors as well as known personalities, which is to say, she's so generous. She herself is currently writing a memoir, which I can't wait to read because her personal essays, which have been published in Elle, The Rumpus, the Virginia Quarterly Review, hold her voice and make you feel like you know her and you want to know more. She has a monthly column on hot books, which appears in the Post. Her book reviews and author profiles appear in the LA Times, Poets and Writers, on NPR Books, among others. She is the author of 2 books for National Geographic and the editor of an anthology as well. Bethanne is here tonight to talk with our featured guest, Gish Jen, who has the audacity to be a Yankees fan while living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Tonight's talk.
Wait. Correction. I am actually a Red Sox fan.
Have you made the leap?
I have, but my whole family, everyone in my family,
you all migrated.
But
strike that from the recording. Gish Jen, who is like gearing up for Red Sox season, watching every Fort Myers training session, I'm sure. Tonight's talk, Opening China, Opening Lives, will focus on her new book of connected stories, Thank You, Mr. Nixon, which covers the time period from the 70s to the current day. She is the author of 9 books, both fiction and nonfiction, including Typical American, Mona in the Promised Land, The Girl at Baggage Claim, The Love Wife, The Resistors, speaking of baseball, Tigers and Tigers Writing. Assimilation, what it means to be American, the efficacy of this American experiment, the intergenerational dynamics of families are themes that recur in her work. Another feature of her writing is how funny it is. The writer Carol Burns, who interviewed Gish in Plowshares, wrote, in part, the wickedness of Jen's humor belies the seriousness of her social commentary. From that interview, I want to just read this gorgeous paragraph where Gish says, I see fiction as restoring to the world some of its actual complexity. When you look at something, what your brain actually registers is very much more complicated than what you see. What you see is what your brain has made of its impressions, a coherent picture it has put together out of what might not have been coherent at all. Our brains have evolved to produce what it thinks to be the most useful picture possible, as if we are still hunter-gatherers. So when we look at a tree trunk, for example, our eyes see many colors, which our brain has learned to make into something we call brown, which executive summary may not actually be so useful to us today, especially when it comes to people. Painters try to undo this report making, and so do we fiction writers. I mean, what is it, say, a middle-aged woman, right? We are anti-generic description because reality is complicated, and we are all more alive for our appreciation of that. Isn't that beautiful? I love that. And she said that. It wasn't written. It was part of an interview. Gish's honors include the Lannan Literary Award for Fiction and the Mildred and Harold Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Science. I will welcome you two. Thank you so much for being here, and I will let you take it from here.
Thank you, Lynn, so much. Gish, what an immense pleasure this is. It would be better if we were all in person, but you know what? As we found over these Zoom years, it is so wonderful to welcome people who wouldn't be in that room with us, who are here from other states and cities and countries, and welcome. I'm so glad to be able to give you a little bit of time with Gish Jen about her remarkable new collection of linked stories. Thank you, Mr. Nixon. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention two things. One, Gish, is that the book is from Alfred A. Knopf, your publisher, wonderful, wonderful imprint. And number two, you appeared on an amazing list today, Esquire's 50 top science fiction books of all time. Did you know
Really?
that? Yes,
No, I did not know that.
Yes, the
Oh,
Resistors.
wow.
I know. I thought this is really cool. It's you, Murakami, Ishiguro, Arthur C. Clarke, Ray Bradbury, Octavia Butler. I mean, just really, really cool. So on top of everything else, your girl Gish Jen here is a storied science fiction author. Welcome. Thanks for being here from your Cambridge Airy, shall I say.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thank you for that incredible news.
I know, that's really, it's very cool. Now, I want to, because I always forget this, I get very excited when I'm interviewing authors, and I forget to talk about the actual book for a couple of minutes, which many of you out there may not have read yet. I hope you read it soon. But Gish, would you tell us a little bit about Thank You, Mr. Nixon, and how its stories are linked? I mean, that doesn't mean any spoilers. It just means explaining how they're tied together.
Yeah. So Thank You, Mr. Nixon starts with a young girl who actually was a made-up girl who was there during Richard Nixon's famous 1972 visit to China. And that is the moment, of course, that led to the whole reality that we take, that we see so natural today, where things are made in China, and we talk about Chinatown. We're very concerned about China's role, vis-a-vis the Ukraine crisis. But, none of this would have happened had Richard Nixon not gone to China. It's almost hard to believe that 50 years ago that the bamboo curtain was this impenetrable thing. And truly, there was a lot more communication across the Iron Curtain than there was across the bamboo curtain. The bamboo curtain was just an amazing a fact of life. But in any case, so it's my book starts there, and it follows a number of families through the 50 years that ensued, and so they are linked in many ways. Complicated with some of them. In one case, there's someone is just an immigration lawyer, and she happens to represent somebody in another family, and
exactly. So this is not.
It's not straightforward. It is, I think, the way that life is. The way that how it turns out that your roommate, it turns out, was was the surgeon for your somebody something. It's complicated, and these people are similarly linked in very complicated ways. That said, what you can see in the background of all their lives is kind of this emerging China changing their lives in which they in ways that they themselves are not necessarily aware. But
That's
suddenly there are new
exactly
opportunities. There are new businesses that they can be in. We have new people, in our classrooms. So it's kind of like all of a sudden people who 50 years earlier would never be in a law school classroom in America. Suddenly here they are getting law degrees, and also we have problems in our classrooms that maybe we could not even have imagined 50 years ago. We have issues. I think that I'm like you. I'm a student of American literature, and I'm always looking for kind of whole new problems that have arisen in our time, and I try to capture that stuff, of course, for the page.
Well, I want to mention
a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you mentioned the first story, Thank You, Mr. Nixon, written by this young girl. And I just want to mention that the 50 years Gish is talking about, it really does go through the entire scope. In fact, I want to mention something I think is really cool. For the 5th time, Gish is in the Best American Short Stories 2022 edition with Detective Dog. And that's the last story in the book. And I have read several comments, several other critics saying that this story may go down as the first classic short story of the COVID era, the first short story to really address the pandemic. And so this is a wide swath that you're cutting here with 50 years, and it could be overwhelming. And yet somehow you have attacked this material, and I don't mean attacked, I mean tackled it, engaged with it, and managed to almost make each story about a separate era in its own way, even when there are several eras involved. So I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of people listening and a lot of readers who want to know if that was the real challenge for you, or if something else was the challenge for you in this book.
Well, let me just sort of say that many of these stories were written over the years, right? I mean, a lot of it did get written during COVID. So there were 5 new stories, some of them quite long, including Detective Dog, some of them quite long. So it's a combination of kind of older material and brand new material. And so the stories were just, I'm just writing stories over the years, and sure enough, the times are changing, so I mean, I'm not, I'm just kind of writing things that I'm finding on the sidewalk, right? And I'm not really thinking, oh, is that historically determined? But it's a little bit like, one of these time-lapse cameras, because or a flash bulb camera, you take a picture, then you take a picture 5 years later, and sure enough, something's changed. And 5 years later, so a certain amount of change was just there in my stories. And then when I thought about collecting them, I saw that, and I realized, oh, if you frame it, you can really kind of bring out the motion of history in the background, which I do think is it's always interesting to us. I mean, you don't have to be Asian American to sort of feel like it's just so interesting the way we are at once ourselves and we are the products of our time,
Yes.
But the products of our time part is kind of, it's hard to see, because we're in it.
It is.
And so as a fiction writer, I'm always really interested in sort of bringing that to the foreground. And I could see that in this case, because I had these stories, that I could do that. But it was tricky, to get back to your question, it was tricky to bring that forward. And so that first story and last story were very critical bits of writing, and let me just sort of say I was fully engaged. I was aware of my problem.
Yeah.
And my first story, as I said it, and I think just to give also the reader a sense of what was coming up and the scale of it. As the first story is as a letter written by a young girl, but she's writing it from heaven. So she's writing it posthumously
Well,
from
that's
heaven.
what I want to say. I'll keep going.
It's addressed to Richard Nixon in hell. So.
Yes, that is the thing. This is what I wanted to say about the first and last stories. And because we're talking about opening China and opening lives, the book opens with this funny address. And you think, I wonder what that means, Pit Road number 7, Ring Road number, whatever it is, in Pit number 9. And then, of course, you realize at the end that it's, the road and the pit in hell where Richard Nixon happens.
He's in the ninth ring.
Bringing this
Where he
Darwinian
belongs.
idea.
Pit 1A.
Pit 1A. But then,
I don't want to give it away, but she does very generously, offer to just, if he wants to try to petition for a cooler pit, that she feels, she says that she'll go
just great.
sign the petition.
What I wanted to say is and I'm not going to spoil this, the last line of the last story, Detective Dog, is crucial and very surprising. And for me as a critic, but also I think for anyone reading about China, to see two such surprising lines at the start and at the finish is remarkable. It's truly remarkable, and it shows, and this is why I wanted to say it, it shows how engaged you were. It shows how carefully you thought through what you were trying to say, which is, yes, none of this would have happened if Nixon hadn't gone to China. We all know Nixon in China, the opera, we all know about the era, we all know about differences in trade sanctions and all of these sorts of things. But here we also see that fictional way of displaying complexity. And we see what is going on in so many different people's lives and families' lives, and that none of this is all good or all bad. That opening China it's incredible, it's important, but there are pros and cons.
It's complicated.
It's complicated. So one of the things I was really surprised but yet also sort of made sense to me is you have a character who says, the problem with America, he's upset with his kids, and he says, the problem with America is its 20th century ideas. Am I getting that right?
He says, don't let your children become America. You know what I mean? Don't let them get that American way of thinking. Because you know what that way of thinking is? It's 20th century.
Exactly. So let's start with that. What does that mean? And we know what it means, but to him, what does that mean? The 20th century to him is all about freedom, or is it all about industry? Is it all about capitalism? What does he mean?
Well, I actually think that for him, a lot of American ideas are antiquated. I think, honestly, because they're too tied up with like human rights and other ideas that we actually hold to be quite dear.
Right, exactly.
So he thinks we need to move, also, here in America, we still have quite an attachment to place. And I think that, I have heard people in Asia say this, home is where the job is, weirdly, they went from a very, very deep attachment to place to kind of no attachment to place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they see us as kind of, a little brick and mortar, if you will.
That's
that we are,
interesting.
that we have a lot of nostalgia for things that they feel like are really kind of just, they're just passé. And, the same way that they think they can't believe that, that we people in America still use cash, So
Oh,
it's a
I
very
love
funny,
that. I love
yeah,
that.
you have this incredibly quick switch from, in the beginning, they're the backwards ones, and it quickly goes from they're the backward ones to we're the backward ones,
Yep.
and well, because they skipped the whole brick and mortar thing. They went straight to the digital age. They do feel that, we're very slow and yeah.
That is, I think, a really interesting encapsulation of something going on in this book. Skipping the brick and mortar stage, going straight to the digital age. One of the things that Trisha says that just made me laugh out loud is she's talking about Mao, and she's talking about some pretty hard stuff that went on. And she says, but he might be what you call an out of the box thinker. I thought, you know what? I understand what she's saying, because she certainly wasn't praising Mao or anything like that.
Yeah.
But the entire collection is about people having their ideas and sometimes their lives upended. And I don't just mean the Chinese people. I mean the American people, the Chinese American people, everyone. People in Thank You, Mr. Nixon, don't always know what's around the corner, even when it's like when you're Johnson Koo and you're a billionaire. That doesn't mean that life is going to go in a straight line. I did think that the collection, as we were saying a few minutes ago, because of the interlinked stories and the complexity of ideas, shows that no one gets it all. It doesn't matter if you're a capitalist, a good socialist, or someone who wants to change the world. You still have problems. You still have to contend with whatever is in front of you. And I think this is where I wanted to get into the women characters, because they are important to you and to me, Gish. And one person says there's China the dream and China the reality. And that happens to be a white American man who says that. But the reason I wanted to quote it is I think the Chinese women are so often the ones who deal with China the reality. So could you talk to me about some of the characters who are women, whether it's a very young woman like Trisha, the girl, or a woman like Bobby Koo, who is in several of the stories and endures quite a bit, again, without any spoilers?
Well, without any spoilers, I have always written both male and female characters, equally, right? And but it is true that it's, I don't want to say that the men are. I don't want to say that they're bit players or anything like that.
No, they're
not fair to say. But it is true that the women are frequently can kind of put themselves in the middle of the situation in a kind of an important way. And so this is not a statement about life, but it is true that I have a lot of women. I don't support stereotypes, obviously. Do you know what I mean? And sort of obviously the whole idea of a dragon lady is deeply, deeply abhorrent to me.
Right.
But it is true that the women in this collection are one after another, huge fountains of energy and doing and strength. They are strong, they are imaginative, they are flexible, and they are definitely the opposite of any kind of Madame Butterfly. I mean, they're
right. Oh yeah, no, that is not what I'm saying.
They so don't fit those stereotypes. I mean, I can't even. It's hard to even imagine anybody coming at them that way. That's, to me, that's true to life. I mean, I know, the women are movers and shakers, I guess I would say, and in different ways. I mean, very, very different ways. I mean, some of them are political and some of them are not political. Some of them are deeply, violently anti-political or apolitical, but they're nonetheless, they are all forces to contend with, I think.
They
you know.
are all forces to contend with. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the women is, well, there are two different stories. One is one of the longer stories, The Great Wall. And I wanted to talk there about Opal, the mother of Grace Chen de Castro, and Grace and her husband, Gideon, and their Grace's mother, Opal, have made this trip after the bamboo curtain has come down because they're able to, and they leave their 4-year-old daughter, Amaryllis, back home with Gideon's mother. And Opal has a really surprising trip. And at first you think Opal of the Straight Back is going to be a very stereotypical, prim, proper, not necessarily an Asian stereotype, but a stereotype of a mother, of a matron, of someone going on, on this trip, and I can't be bothered with this. And instead, not only does she show incredible kindness to a younger woman of lower station, but she also has a moment with her own family that, well, it ripped me to pieces, Gish. Thanks so much. It did. It ripped me to pieces. And I thought, this is quite important. Does this character have special meaning for you?
Well, she does, in the sense that, of course, one of the things that, when you were asking me earlier about what was a challenge, and, when I was really trying to put together a collection, it did occur to me there were some things that I wanted to say, if you will, in the sense that we don't say things, we don't say things like capitalism is bad.
Right.
That's not the kind of things that fiction
That's
writers
not what you're after.
But it is true that I wanted to capture something about the Chinese and this idea of guanxi that a lot of people have heard about,
Yeah.
So a lot of people, they know that relationships are really important in China. And then when they think of it, when Americans think of it, they think of it in a very transactional way. Now, it can be quite transactional, but it is not actually always transactional at all. And it occurred to me that, that I had not seen very many representations of this on the page, the way that guanxi actually works. So guanxi means, relationship, right? And, people often think it means that you have pull, like I'll scratch your back and you'll scratch mine,
Right. Right.
and they think, and it's exactly like that. It's kind of like, well, I'm going to give you this chit and I'm expecting something. And like I said, it can be that way. But I think what you see in this story is the guanxi as I have so often witnessed it in China, which is a very generous kind of simply stepping forward for an awareness of other people's plight, and very simple human stepping forward for them. So in this case, without giving away too much of my story,
Right.
the tour guide on this, it's a very early days of Chinese tourism, and it's a big deal to be a guide for one of these, or one of these trips, to guide the Americans. And this woman has been given this job really because her father was so muckety-muck, and so she was given this job. She doesn't even want the job, but she has it, and it becomes very clear in the first seconds of her being in front of the tour group that her English is not actually very good and no one can understand her. So it's this horrifying moment where the group is realizing, like, we have a guy who doesn't really speak English. And she also is realizing, what, I am in this terrible situation. And at that moment, Opal Chen, who's actually from, as you say, a very different background, she's from a very aristocratic background,
Yes.
she just steps forward to translate. And she just does it out of just sheer human feeling.
Yes.
And she translates. And then later on, the tour guide sees a chance to pay her back, and she does,
And she does.
And that,
go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, and to me in China, this is so much the way that it works. It's much more of it's almost like a yin yang movement. It's just like a wave, like this wave sent up this wave. Opal Chen, when she offered to translate, had no intention of ever expecting a favor from the tour guide. Do you know what I mean? In other words, it never crossed her mind. She simply, and the tour guide on her side is simply like, you know what? I see you need something and I'm going to help you. And like I say, and I think this is something because things are so different in the West, Westerners really, they see this kind of motion. And to them, in our, in this capitalist world, it can only be tit for tat. I mean,
As you said,
the only
transactional.
it's got to be transactional. But I have seen this 100 million times, and I can tell you, it's not transactional. It's not transactional. It's real, actually, kind of deeply human. And so that is something that, when I sat down, I just thought, what, I would really I'd like to try to get that on the page. This thing that I have seen.
Well,
so many times.
That is something that was really important to me. And thank you, Mr. Nixon, as well, in terms of our theme tonight, because you're not just opening China in terms of here's a character or a situation. You manage in each story to take something like Guanxi that Westerners may have some knowledge of, may have some inkling of, shall we say, since most of us don't know very much about China. But you take it and you give it that back and forth, like, here's the good, here's the bad. And maybe there's not bad for Opal in that story, but you'll show another situation where things, are much stranger or darker. And you do it with the concept of Guanxi. You do it with the idea of tea and its importance. You do it with clothing. There's one moment where a whole trope about coats, which comes up in the first story, there's just a little tiny bit that ties that together in another story where there's a coat shop that makes custom coats. And so there's so many things that come up that people can learn from, and learn are, again, complex, not, all good or not all bad. And the shortest story, to come back to the idea of the leaving behind stereotypes, Lulu in Exile is not very long, but it's got a good punch. It's a fun story, but it's also it is a punch. And Lulu finds out how strong a mother can be when she wants something specific for her son. And I thought, this is by no means upholding a stereotype, but it is also not sparing that kind of mother. It is not letting her off the hook for her manipulative ways. And this is what you do so well, Gish. And so for you, with your history and your background, how has it taken your whole life to come to terms with China is good and China is bad? Is that
it's taken my whole life to do it, but it's taken my whole life to kind of to have the skills to sort of bring out as much nuance as I know to be there. So, and it is tricky territory, because, I am writing in a Western context. And so, yeah, it's sort of, you both, I don't shy away, as you're sort of saying, from, how I see it, so I'm not going to whitewash. Do you know what I mean? I mean, so, there's some tough truths in there about everybody, you know what I mean? I mean, it's not just, it's not confined to any group or anything like that. It kind of goes back to, the first quote that Lynn read about trying to present things as they are, and maybe help us understand our own filters, understand that we do filter, and try to present the actual truth, which of course is very complicated. And yeah, there's no right or wrong. It's, everybody is just human.
well,
But I mean, I think that I have always felt that way, but getting it across to a Western audience is complicated, I will say. There's a lot of disarming that has to go on. There's a lot of framing that has to go on. People, the sort of the popular thing right now, I think it's very, a lot of people from ethnic minorities kind of believe that you should just write as if you were just telling it to somebody in your family, and you should not explain to a Western, a non-ethnic audience, that you're pandering. I feel like I'm actually an American writer, and I am interested in the American audience. And what's more, I don't feel like I'm being colonized or anything like that. I mean, I don't think that I have a colonial mindset where I feel like I have to serve the master. I don't have any of that. But what I do
I would say
think is
not.
that I definitely not. But what I do feel is a responsibility for making America, and that includes making an America in which I also will thrive. Do you know what I mean? And it's an America that's better for me, and it's America for everybody. And that does involve, kind of sometimes addressing misconceptions head on. So that's to sort of say, like, I don't think to just, to speak as if I'm speaking to myself and to my family around the dinner table. To me, that's not what a writer is. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's not enough. And so I do sort of feel like to take it and to make it into a form where other people can sort of begin to sort of at least see that, well, maybe I didn't realize that, or, I didn't see it that way.
I'm looking down because I'm looking for a quote from one of the stories, and it's about it's the one about law school and about Gunner.
Crime and Punishment and Law and War and Peace.
And there is a wonderful quote where the Rich Lee, the narrator, says, not only were all the rest of us suspicious of this very waspy white classmate as the ideal, but we wanted to know what made him the ideal in the first place. How did he become the ideal? And with what you were just saying, Gish, right now there is so much fear, real fear among Asians in America, whether they're Asian American or Asian, about violence and about racism and ideas that are completely unjust. And one of the things I noticed, for the Koo family being billionaires, Tina and Johnson Koo, the patriarch and matriarch, they have to contend with the idea that you were talking earlier about hopping from one place to the other instead of having one home, going to Vancouver, going to Shanghai, going to New York. And yet they say in Vancouver, people are starting to have hatred of Asians. And so they're encountering racism. And I think, even though I've known this, because I was reading it in fiction, it really hit me for the first time that this is real racism. This has nothing to do with education or culture or money. This has to do with skin and origin. And I don't know how to say that without sounding almost like a simpleton, but I think it's extraordinarily important to see that in the characters in the book, that they do not, just because of incredible material good, they do not escape the wrongs in this world.
Yeah, there's no protection. And the fact that they do have all this money, and they're subject to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually true, but I will say that, even though, of course I am anti-racism, and of course all this stuff is horrific and terrible. That said, I have to say that I think that for me as a fiction writer, it's the whole to understand that racism is such a potent part of what goes on in America is not enough. Mm-hmm. And that, in the case of the Asian and the Asian Americans, that there's another piece, and that piece is culture. It's really hard to write about. And like I said, everyone is really on the racist narrative, and that's great. And I don't want to undo that, because it is an incredible problem. It's an incredible problem. Every time I walk into a room, I'm just aware that, like, I'm not the authority figure. You know what I mean? I mean, just people look at me, they look like, well, where's the speaker? It's a very funny thing. I mean, they're just, they're looking for someone who's not me, but also someone who's just taller, you're too small to be the speaker, And Well, but it's true. I mean, it's we're very, we're still hunter
I'm
gatherers.
short too. I really understand.
Yeah.
Yes.
The height problem is like, well,
Yes.
every lectern, when you stand, especially at the older lecterns, you can see the assumption about who would be standing in the front of the room, right? I mean, of course, right? So we can see this now. The lecterns are adjustable, thank God, right?
Yes.
But the older ones, you can see the assumptions. But like I say, in the case of Asian and Asian Americans, there is another piece, and that is that that Asia is a far, far away place. I mean, I know that all immigrants travel a big difference,
Sure.
a big distance. But Asian Americans, particularly, China, and because China, all the particulars, you know what I mean? Because they didn't really ever care about the West, the fact that they were the middle country for such a long time and have such a strong culture. Many studies have shown that, when an Asian American or Chinese American marries out, that person becomes sinicized. I mean, the Chinese culture is a very powerful thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to kind of capture that difference and how much that is also at play. Do you know what I mean? In other words, so so when people say things like, well, but they all they stick together. Do you know what I mean? They're really talking about a different kind of self, a self that is also an adaptation to circumstances, just like the Western self is an adaptation to circumstances, because the circumstances are so different, you get very different selves. And then the rules are completely different, so when we think about our ideas about originality, something that is so important in the West. And
I have to interrupt. Yes, I have to interrupt you because this is exactly what I thought was fascinating. And it plays into, and then I'll let you finish the thought. Betty Koo says that once she read a book about Western creativity and how it grew up like a flower out of the soil of curiosity. And that is meant to be a way of saying, look how great the West is and Western creativity. But as you're saying, that isn't the only way. Please go on. I'm so sorry.
It's not the only way. It's not the only way. And that's, so, and I will sort of say, in both ways get kind of caricatured in the other culture. So when the West looks east, they've got to take the worst examples of, people, they take the copycat phenomenon, and they take the worst things and they basically use that to kind of create kind of this kind of caricature of what Eastern ideas about education are. And then, but then they'll suddenly be confronted with a very great, a great work of Eastern art. And they'll think, well, I mean, it just like, does not compute. Like, it's not possible that a piece of art that is really indisputably great, like nobody would argue that this is a great thing. It is not possible that it comes from this other culture, except of course that it does. And similarly, in all, the East looks West, and they all they see are are the bums in the streets, and the complete incredible disorder in the society, and they don't see that actually we've invented a lot of things in the West. Do you know what I mean? Like a lot of things. So actually, both sides have, both sides, you can look at the top or you could look at the bottom, or you could look at them, in other words, there's merit on both sides. But one of the things about culture, of course, is, it is the great thing that humans, it is our single, biggest ace, right? That we have culture. That's why we are able, of all the beings on Earth, we are able to live in Antarctica, and we can live in the equator, we can live in the desert, we can live, we can live anywhere. It's because we've learned this thing, and that is that we learn to adapt, and we've learned to pass that adaptation on. So so it's incremental, so that it's no one could figure out how to live in the desert in one generation, right? It's hundreds of generations, and then they know how to do it, right? Because they can pass it on. But the thing about culture is that for it to work the best, it has to be kind of invisible to the people. Like, you internalize it and you're not aware of it. And also it's best when you reject things that are not that. And that this business of rejecting is a very, very, it's a very, very foundational impulse that we have. and we reject things which are not self, and that's a lot of what's going on with the Asian Americans, is this kind of rejection of something which is frankly just not Western, and that's where in a book like mine, I'm trying to get at some of those deeper layers, so that racism is important, and that's definitely what's going on. But there is also sort of a fundamental kind of rejection of this whole way of thinking, even though, some part of the West sort of realizes actually there is some merit to it. And if it wasn't so much merit, why are we so threatened?
Why are we so threatened? And that
why are you so afraid of them? If that's such a terrible way to be, then why are we so worried, right?
Why? And this is a beautiful way to segue to questions, because why are we so worried? We can learn so much from other cultures. We can also bring those cultures into our own. And everyone is watching. I know you're going to read Thank You, Mr. Nixon, but don't forget to read the story Rothko, because that addresses a great deal of what Gish has just been talking about. So I am going to let Nikki bring up the questions. And if we don't have questions, or if people are nervous about asking them, I can talk to Gish for a couple of minutes about things that are highly interruptible. I've already done enough interrupting myself. I'll let other people do this for a while. But as we're thinking about questions, I know that one of the things that I really appreciate about your work, Gish, is you are an exceptional stylist. And so you have, of course, lots of Western influences, but we're talking about opening China. So I was wondering if you have a few Chinese and/or Chinese American authors you might like to recommend to our audience.
Well, this is it. Among the Chinese Americans, of course, Maxine Hong Kingston, right?
Yes.
I have to say there are a lot of really cool younger writers as well. And I wish there were more, because of course, everyone that I've left out will be horribly offended, but Wei Ke Wang, for instance, I think is really talented. Yeah, I think she's really talented. Among my contemporaries, I just feel like I myself could read Eon Lee like every day for the rest of my life.
Hello, Yan. Shout out to you. Yes, we
Yeah,
could all read her
yeah.
every day.
But truly, but there are actually quite a number of the younger writers coming up are really talented, and so I would just sort of flag that. In terms of sort of old oldies but goodies that people have maybe not be familiar with, I would say Eileen Zhang, Eileen Chang, I guess, like Love in a Fallen City and all these stories of Shanghai. And what you'll see here is this very, it's funny because China in the Western imagination, and again, you could sort of see just as in that quote that Lynn gave mine early on, we make these pictures. And then, and I think our picture of China is as if something is very aggressive, right? Because we're always hearing about like all the bad things the government is doing, and they're taking over those islands and near Vietnam and so on. And that stuff is very bad, and I am against it. But if you look at Eileen Chang, you can also see this tremendous kind of gentleness, actually, of Chinese culture, and you'll see those kinds of this kind of diffidence, it's like,
what a good word. Because
yeah,
I'm thinking of Ha Jin, and
Ha Jin is so wonderful.
So wonderful. And I see that calmness and that diffidence in Ha Jin's writing all the time. And it is really striking to me. It's A Free Life. Oh, everyone, if you haven't read that one, there's another recommendation. So I
down to earth.
Yes, very down to earth. I know.
I love the line. I think he has a line like, if I had to do it again, I would marry someone who could eat like 20 eggs in a sitting. I just love that. Because he had a somewhat sickly wife. But there's a lot of, I just think that so right now, especially with tensions so high between the US and China, it's just really easy to forget that the government is not the people. you know, and the people are truly, 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 truly nothing like the government. It's really kind of amazing how much so. Not all the people, some of the people are, it's just like, are the Russians like all like Putin? Obviously not,
No,
you know.
and we do have a couple of questions that are wonderful, and I will say, Lynn Bolger says that she loved the conversation, and it was one that you had maybe with Scott Simon on NPR when you say there are enough Chinese Americans writing now that you have the freedom not to be the representative.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like, for instance, a lot of people writing about identity. I feel like, oh, I don't have to write about identity. I'll write about US-China relations,
Yeah, why not? Just a little political,
or some science fiction novel, some crazy science fiction novel. Right?
There you go.
I mean, that's not something earlier in my career. I don't think I would have felt the freedom to go ahead and write this as, surveillance state, feminist baseball dystopia. I just don't think that really, well, because I think I would have felt the responsibility to get certain things on the page that, were just not there. But now there are so many people writing, you sort of feel like, okay, I can write about whatever angle
you don't have to play the good girl. You don't have to be, an avatar.
I don't have to be representative.
Now,
Yeah,
Anne Elizabeth Moore says, Gish, I absolutely love this book, particularly the nuance with which you approach the idea of living a political life. And it seems like part of that was due to the extended time period you took to write the book. But I'm wondering if you had any specific approaches or ideas with this in mind, or if you can address why nuance was so important here.
Nuance, I don't know if it's with regard to sort of what it means to be political, or just, in a general kind of way, nuance to me is everything, I mean, I feel like that's what fiction is for. I feel like, we have, look, I understand that, the things have to be simplified. If you need to get a message out, you need to get people to vote, you need that, there's a lot of button pushing, and, there's a lot of simplifying that needs to go on in order to motivate people. And, I can see that's wonderful. But for understanding what it means to be human, which is finally why we read these books, I think nuance is, I think it, it is everything. Don't you think?
Mm-hmm. It absolutely.
And so, yes. Yes. And then particularly when you're looking at, writing about a group that's not the dominant group, I think all the more reason to be very, very careful to include the immense variety of human experience.
One of the things I want to bring up in terms, Anne Elizabeth, of that question is, and I'm sorry that I'm not remembering the titles of all the stories right now, but the story about the young woman who becomes a caretaker for an elderly uncle, an elderly man. And toward the end of the story, one of his actual relatives, who is a young Turk on Wall Street, comes to, ask questions and visit and figure out what's going to happen next. And it would be so easy to see this young Asian American man with his, really great clothes, and he makes so much money on Wall Street and all this. But then he is vulnerable as well. There's nuance in his story as well. And you have some sympathy. He says, I'm carrying all of this family stuff on my back. They expect, because I make all of this money, that I will take care of everyone. And you have this glimpse, this window opening into another person's struggle. And that's why we read and write fiction. Scott Sawyer says, this is my introduction to Gish Jen, and holy cow, I feel like her biggest fan. Embodies and articulates the best aims of writing. Nuance to me is everything. Framing is important. Her books are on the way to my door. Go Gish, and thank you, Authors Guild. That is Scott. Thank you. That is amazing. I'm so delighted that you read Thank You, Mr. Nixon, and this is your intro, because now you have all of these other amazing Gish Jen books to read. That's why we do what we do. That's why authors like Gish make themselves available, because we want to find people who will respond. I mean, that's just that's really fantastic.
Thank you, Authors Guild, and thank you, Bethanne.
Oh, thank you so much. I do want to, because we have a couple of minutes. Lynn says Bethanne loved the Young Turk reference. I never hear that anymore. I'll tell you a secret. This is just to make everyone laugh. The other day, I'm working on a podcast with some people who are much younger than I am. And I said, listen, so-and-so, don't give me any guff. And they said, what? Don't give me any guff? What are you doing? I thought, oh well, we have to keep old style slang alive. But I will ask one more thing.
From Lindsay has her hand raised.
Oh, of course. Thank you, Nikki. Lindsay.
Hi. Thank you so much for this. It was wonderful. And Gish, it's really a thrill to hear you talk. I've been reading you for years. I have an adopted daughter from China who I adopted at 6 months old. And your novel, The Love Wife, was one of the most moving things I read and one of the most helpful. So thank you so much for that. But I also want to actually ask you something more practical. I was very struck by your discussion of the significance of cultural differences. And I'm also a teacher. I teach at NYU. I have increasingly a large number of international students, most of whom are Chinese, in my classrooms. And it's really an ongoing struggle as to know how to balance between the kind of expectations of an American educational system and the cultural differences that they bring to the room. And I'm just curious, I realize that this is very niche, but I'm curious if you have any insights into, well, what are your thoughts about that? What should I expect or ask or grade? Participation is one of the key things, obviously. The unwillingness to speak aloud is very cultural, and it's hard. So I'm just very interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, let me say, first of all, that I actually have written a book that is just for people like you, and that is The Girl at the Baggage Claim, Explaining the East-West Culture Gap. And I actually wrote that with educators in mind,
Right.
So that you might find that helpful. And
Thank you.
About the speaking in class piece particularly, there, and I do talk about this in that book. There has been a study done that just, it's because it's cultural, so, we think that we can just ask these students just to talk.
Yeah.
And, but actually their cortisol levels are spiking like crazy. Do you know what I mean? It is just so fundamentally, unacceptable from their point of view.
Right.
By the way, this tension comes up in the story that Bethanne talked about earlier, Mr. Crime and Punishment and War and Peace.
Mm-hmm.
So there also there is an immigrant. A brilliant immigrant law student who just really does not feel comfortable taking up all this room in the classroom. But I will say, as a practical matter, because I've taught abroad a lot, and so I was teaching at NYU Shanghai, where of course the expectation is that you are in an American classroom, and class participation really matters. I found that starting the semester by talking about that study really helped them. Like it helped them that it helped them that I understood them, and then helped them that it helped them that I understood how difficult it was for them. And also I think I just explained to them that this is something like they've gone to so much to such lengths to learn English, that this is just another thing like learning English. You know what I mean? That if they want to participate in this larger world, it's just another skill. And I found that framing it that way really helped them. And so by the end of the semester, they were all talking. But if you just say just talk.
No, I know.
And then they're savvy enough to also see it as a species of colonialism and so on. So that would be my tip.
I try to do small group work also to give them a voice, but that's very helpful. Thank you so much.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome.
We have one last question from Lewis. And of course, he says, mind broadening talk, and then writes in Chinese that I can't read, but maybe Gish can. But it says, thank you. I have not yet read the book, certainly will. It sounds as an extraordinary contribution to intercultural exchange and the awareness of all of us being humans. Would you agree that maybe American culture sometimes lacks the ability to acknowledge and learn from other cultures because within neoliberalism and capitalism does thrive in America, one of the concepts is to be the one and only winner. And that is one of the problems there is, of course, a winner doesn't accept or acknowledge others.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, at this point, first of all, America is an incredibly diverse place. And so when we think about America, here too, we have a dominant self, which is actually that, there are many, 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 many people who do not have this dominant self. That's, and that's, we see it in the advertising, it's imprinted and reimprinted and reimprinted, even though really it's not a match for many, many, many people in America. But I do think that we've gotten to the point we have, individualism is great, but I think that some people in America have reached a point where it's really become kind of toxic. I think that we could see that during a lot of COVID, where a lot of people refused to wear a mask. It's like my freedom, no matter what. It doesn't matter what the repercussions are. And I think that this level of individualism is got to give us all pause. So it's just just as Bethanne said, it's not that I'm for individualism or anti-individualism, but I do think that that there is a point at which some of the negative aspects might be looked at, frankly, and we might think about reining it in. And I do think that, I think that all cultures, whenever you have power, you have a bubble, and in the bubble, of course, you're always in the middle of the bubble. And I think American culture is no exception that way. And so we build this bubble and we use it, to keep other voices out, even if it's at our peril, and even as it is a danger to us, literally a danger, and also maybe just doesn't lead to our thriving. And that's the part that I'm interested in, because I think that I think that we have the capacity now in the in the 21st century to construct cultures that enable human thriving. And I think but it requires a little bit of thought. And so I'm all in favor of people kind of asking hard questions as you are, and hopefully, making the soil a little richer, that we may grow a little taller in a more floriferous way.
I love that. I know we are out of time, even though I, for one, would love to stay for another couple of hours, but I will let Lynn come back and lead us all out of this incredible discussion. Thank you, Gish, and thank you, Lynn, and thank you to the Authors Guild. Also, I don't want to forget Nikki. Thanks for your help tonight. And to all of you, we couldn't be here talking like this without having an audience. So really appreciate your time and support.
Okay, I think that we should just have Bethanne do these from now on. Every time. So amazing. Thank you both so very much for taking time. And it just, these talks reinforce the importance of reading and talking about what we write. And so thank you so much. And with that, I'll say happy spring, everybody, and good night.
Good night. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.